You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter @RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans. Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am the Jacob Valk, except no imitation. I've got to start with Browns Steelers. This game will likely go down in history as Ben Roethlisberger's last home game. There's a part of me that would like this to be Roethlisberger's last game, period. Like, I remember the farewell tours of Derek Jeter and Mariano Rivera. And make no mistake about it, Roethlisberger is just as important to the Steelers as Jeter and Rivera are to the Yankees. I mean, I remember when those schedules came out, one of the first things that I looked at was, where do the Yankees finish their seasons? In 2013, Rivera's last year, the Yankees finished their season in Houston. In 2014, Jeter's last year, the Yankees finished their season in Boston. Now, Joe Girardi did the right thing. In 2013, Rivera didn't pitch in any games in Houston. His last moment on the mound was Jeter and Andy Pettitte coming out to pull him. And it's a great moment. I wasn't there for it. I don't remember why I wasn't there, but I was not at that game. I wish I was. Pop quiz. You know who came in after Rivera? You know who followed the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show? Matt Daley. Poor Matt Daley has to come in and get the last out after one of the most emotional moments in baseball history. Give Daley credit. He got Ben Zobrist to strike out on 3 pitches. But man alive, could you imagine what was going through Daley's mind at that moment? Poor soul. So look, it worked out for Rivera that his last game was at Yankee Stadium, even though the Yankees finished their season in Houston. Jeter's last game was not at Yankee Stadium. He played 2 games against the Red Sox, so his last game was at Fenway Park. There's a similarity between Jeter's last game being at Fenway Park and Roethlisberger's last game being at M&T Bank Stadium. You don't want a franchise icon to finish his career at the rival's home stadium. You just don't. That's not the way the movie should end. Let it end with him trotting off Heinz Field in victory. Now look, he has to play on Sunday. Okay, there's no way around it. The Steelers actually still have a chance to sneak into the playoffs. They need to beat the Ravens on Sunday. The Jaguars need to beat the Colts. And the Sunday night game, Chargers-Raiders, can't end in a tie. So a lot of things need to happen, but there is a chance that the Steelers can sneak into the playoffs. With that possibility still being alive, granted, it's very remote, but it's still alive, Ben Roethlisberger needs to play on Sunday. You'd like his last game to be at Heinz Field. There's no question about that, but it can't happen. I mean, it was a great scene yesterday. Roethlisberger taking it all in. The crowd knew what was happening. The broadcasters knew what was happening. The writers knew what was happening. Here's a future Hall of Famer. The second best quarterback in Steelers history. Some people would even put him ahead of Terry Bradshaw. I'd probably put Bradshaw first. But it's certainly an interesting argument. You have either the best or second best quarterback in Steelers history playing his last home game. Granted, it's not official yet, but if you read the tea leaves, you know that this was probably Roethlisberger's last home game. It's sad that this is how he went out. Most likely not making the playoffs. But even then, the game that he had yesterday, he didn't look all that impressive. He barely completed over 50% of his passes, only threw for 123 yards, threw a touchdown to Deontay Johnson, but also threw an interception. It's not the Roethlisberger that we used to know. I mean, if it wasn't for Najee Harris and TJ Watt and Baker Mayfield's ineptitude, which I'll get into in a minute, the Steelers lose that game. It's sad that Roethlisberger wasn't a bigger part of his last victory at Heinz Field. It's great that he ended it with a win. At the end of the day, that's what history will remember. No one remembers the fact that in Mariano Rivera's last game, the Yankees got shut out by the Rays 4-0. They only remember Rivera being lifted by Jeter and Pettit. This is something that Roethlisberger can look back on in a couple months with a big smile on his face. He went out the right way. I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that this is the right time for him to hang up the cleats. It's clear as day that he's not the quarterback that he once was. He has nothing left to accomplish. Let him start the clock on his inevitable induction to Canton. I said this before about Roethlisberger. I'll say it again. You think about the 3 quarterbacks that were taken in the top 11 of the 2004 draft. Eli 1st overall, Phillip Rivers 4th overall, Roethlisberger 11th overall. Eli's a Hall of Famer because of what he did in the playoffs. But his detractors will point to his subpar regular seasons. Phillip Rivers gets in because of his great regular seasons, but his detractors will point to his subpar playoff efforts. Ben Roethlisberger is the best of both worlds. Here's a guy who has the regular season statistics. 5th most passing yards ever, 8th most touchdowns ever, 5th most completed passes ever, and he was a 6-time Pro Bowler. And also, he won 2 Super Bowls. Granted, he had very little to do with their Super Bowl win in Super Bowl 40. That was more Hines Ward and Willie Parker and the Steelers' defense as a whole, but Super Bowl 43 doesn't happen the same way if Roethlisberger isn't there. If he doesn't lead the Steelers on that great 2-minute drill, and he doesn't put that pass in the perfect spot for Santonio Holmes to catch it, the Cardinals win the Super Bowl. I mean, Roethlisberger is a first ballot Hall of Famer. There's a legitimate argument that you can make against Eli, and there's a legitimate argument that you can make against Rivers. There is no legitimate argument that can be made against Roethlisberger. The only thing that could maybe stand in his way, and even then, this is pushing it, is there was never a season where he was the best quarterback in the NFL. Yes, he has bowl type, but was there ever a year where you would have taken him over a guy like Brady or Rodgers or Manning or Breeze or Wilson? Maybe in a couple years he was top 5. He was never the best. But that's not enough to keep him out of the Hall of Fame. It's an interesting anecdote. I think it's something that deserves to be mentioned, but no, Ben Roethlisberger is a future first ballot Hall of Famer. There's no question about it. As for the Browns, they're in trouble. You remember when the future in Cleveland looked incredibly bright? Baker Mayfield had a bounce-back season, only threw 8 interceptions, threw over 3,500 yards, threw 26 touchdowns, led the Browns to an upset win at Pittsburgh, nearly beat the Chiefs in Kansas City. 10 months ago, the future of the Browns had never looked brighter. Now, there are real questions that need to be asked. Is Baker Mayfield the right guy to lead this team into the future? Because he has regressed hard. This year he's completed just 60.5% of his passes. He's thrown for 3,010 yards, 17 touchdowns to 13 interceptions. This will be a career low in touchdowns for him. It'll be a career low in passing yards for him. I mean, this was the year for Mayfield to really stake his claim to getting a big money deal. Certainly not in the Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen range, but maybe in the Jared Goff, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins range. As of this very moment, there are real questions that need to be asked about Baker Mayfield's future. And I have defended Mayfield more than anyone. Okay, I like Mayfield. I like him a lot. But what you've seen this year and yesterday, you can't be confident in him going forward. You can't get sacked 9 times. I understand that the left side of the line wasn't helping him. Jedrick Wills and Joel Bitonio were really bad. And James Hudson certainly had his hands full dealing with TJ Watt. But that performance that you saw from Mayfield is absolutely inexcusable. In the first half, he was 4 for 15. Yet for some stupid reason, Kevin Stefanski decided to let Mayfield keep throwing the ball rather than handing it off to Nick Chubb. There was no excuse for Chubb to only have 12 carries in that game. That was a dreadful job by Stefanski. Mayfield finished by completing 16 of 38 passes for 185 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Realistically, from the Patriots game on, this guy has looked really bad. I mean, think about it. The Browns had just destroyed the Bengals at Paul Brown Stadium. They were 5-4. You felt optimistic about the Browns going into the second half of the season. You know what Mayfield has done since then? He has completed just over 53% of his passes for under 1,100 yards, 9 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. This is when he should be getting better. Like, he had the bad year under Freddie Kitchens. You can write that off as Kitchens being terrible. So when Stefanski comes in and rights the ship, all the excuses for Mayfield get thrown out the window. I mean, Progressive has to feel like an idiot for picking this guy as their spokesman. They're funny commercials, but you've got to get someone better. This guy probably isn't even in the top half of best quarterbacks in the NFL right now. I mean, I'll tell you something kind of interesting. Odell Beckham looks pretty smart right now. Forcing his way out of Cleveland, going to the Rams, where he has a much better quarterback throwing to him. He's going to be in the playoffs. He's featured in the offense. I mean, Jarvis Landry isn't. There's no excuse for Jarvis Landry to only have one touchdown this year. Don't tell me about the 2 rushing touchdowns. No, I want him to have more than 1 receiving touchdown. Donovan Peoples-Jones cannot have more receiving yards than him. There are real questions that need to be asked about Baker Mayfield. Does he have what it takes to be a franchise quarterback in this league? The Browns obviously guaranteed his 5th-year option. You have to do that before the start of the season before that. You can't wait until after the season. So the Browns can't be begrudged for exercising that option. The thing is, though, Mayfield can be traded. The Browns would save $18,858,000 by trading Baker Mayfield. Could they do that? Could they start over again? The answer is probably not. See, here's the thing. What quarterback that's gonna become available is better than Mayfield by a substantial margin? Aaron Rodgers? Maybe, but you're only getting him for a few years. Russell Wilson? Certainly possible, but a lot of teams are going to be going after him. Deshaun Watson? Do you want that headache? You just got rid of one headache in Beckham. You want to bring in another one? Look, the Browns and Seahawks match up well for a Wilson trade. If I'm a Seahawks fan, I have no problem with my team trotting out Mayfield for a year. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, okay. Because that trade isn't going to be straight up. The Seahawks are going to get some picks. With those picks, maybe, just maybe, you take a guy like Kenny Pickett or Matt Corral. As of right now, the Browns have the 13th overall pick. I don't see Pickett and Corral slipping to 13, even though I don't think either one of them are worthy of top 10 picks. Quarterback needy teams reach all the time. And assuming there are no trades, which, granted, isn't going to happen, there are always trades, but just for argument's sake, let's say all the phone lines in NFL front offices don't work. Washington would take a quarterback at 9, and the Broncos would take a quarterback at 11. I'll say this. If Pickett or Corral slip to 13, if you're the Seahawks and you've pulled off that trade, I think you pull the trigger, but there's nothing wrong with doing what the Lions have done. Taking a quarterback who everyone knows isn't going to be there for a substantial amount of time in Jared Goff. You let him play a little bit, and then when you get the opportunity, you get your franchise quarterback. It's not this year. 2022 isn't the year for it. 2023 is. You can have CJ Stroud in that draft. You can have Bryce Young in that draft. You can have Anthony Richardson in that draft. You can have DJ Uiagalelei in that draft. There's nothing wrong with getting a bridge quarterback in Mayfield if you're the Seahawks. Using the picks that you get to fill other needs, and then in 2023, draft your franchise quarterback. Or, maybe, just maybe, Mayfield has a great season. Doesn't Mayfield strike you as a change of scenery candidate? Don't you think if he went to a Seahawks team that has DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, he'd be better? Like, the thing is, and I don't want to make excuses for Mayfield, but he came to the Browns with sky-high expectations. The first overall pick. He has the burden of all the failed Browns quarterbacks put on his shoulders. He has to deal with Hugh Jackson. He has to deal with Freddie Kitchens. He has to deal with a ton of turmoil. Beckham, Kareem Hunt. The GM that took him, John Dorsey, being fired. It was not a stable environment for Mayfield. Now, granted, he should have been able to overcome it, but if he goes to a Seahawks team with two of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and you get the head coaching hire right, I don't see Pete Carroll staying if the Seahawks are going to go with the youth movement. If Carroll stays, fantastic. If he doesn't, Eric Bieniemy, Brian Daboll, Matt Eberflus, guys like that would make a ton of sense. I'm not giving up on Mayfield. I think he has talent. I don't think he'll ever be the great quarterback that we thought he could be, and that's sad. And you have a right to be upset at that if you're a Browns fan. But one thing that I would caution you about is cutting your nose to spite your face. At the very least, you have a quarterback in Mayfield who's competent. It's okay to want more. But Mayfield is 26 years old. He's going to turn 27 one day before tax day. It's not a good idea to get rid of a soon-to-be 27-year-old quarterback who's shown that he can win in this league, who has shown flashes of greatness, and who you can put out there under center and feel okay about. Again, it's okay to want more than that. But do I need to remind you of the terrible history that your team has in quarterbacks? No, I don't. If you're going to move on from Mayfield, which I'm not opposed to, Okay, I'm really not. You've got to make sure that you're getting a franchise quarterback. It's not in this draft. I've got news for you. Kenny Pickett and Matt Corral are not great. They're not bad. They're really not. But I don't look at them as perennial Pro Bowlers. Best case scenario for those guys, they're around for 15 years. They hold their own. You can put them out there every Sunday, and they give you a chance to win. I'm not saying they're game managers. I think they'll be good. I think they could be very good. I don't think they're great. Be careful of moving sideways. If you are done with Mayfield, if you've lost patience, if you want him to be better in his fourth year, I understand that. And that's okay. But if you're going to replace him with a guy like Pickett or Corral, I don't think you got any better. The only way it works is for Russell Wilson. I don't think Rodgers works. I don't think you get rid of a 27-year-old quarterback for a 38-year-old quarterback. I don't care that it's Aaron Rodgers. I don't care that he may win MVP. You just don't get a decade older at the quarterback position. That's not something you do. And Deshaun Watson maybe can work, but be hesitant of trading for a guy who's been out of the NFL for a whole year and will bring with him a ton of baggage. Russell Wilson would make sense. I think for both teams it would make sense. But that's the only way I could see the Browns moving on from Mayfield. You get a little older at the quarterback position, but not by a ton. 6 years. Granted, that's nothing to sneeze at, but it's not the end of the world. And if you're the Seahawks, you get a quarterback in Mayfield who you can put out there every Sunday and feel okay about. You get a bunch of picks that you can play around with. You don't need to take a quarterback. You can wait until 2023 to do it. Fill out the rest of your roster. And then, if you want to move on from Mayfield after next season, I'm okay with that. Make your big move for a quarterback then. Not in this draft. Instead of settling for a Ryan Tannehill or Derek Carr type, shoot for the moon. But again, if Mayfield balls out, you can sign him to a big extension. Then you're really set. The Browns and Seahawks make sense for a quarterback trade. There's no question about that. I brought up the Pro Football Hall of Fame a little earlier. Ben Roethlisberger will get there at some point. But he won't get in this year. He was not among the 15 finalists that were announced recently. This group of 15 will get narrowed down to 5. And those 5 guys will get into the Hall of Fame. They can be joined by the finalists in the coach, contributor, and senior categories. Those are Dick Vermeil, Art McNally, and Cliff Branch, respectively. Let's go through the finalists now. One thing I'll say before I tell you who the first finalist is yes, I'm going to go alphabetically, but that's not what I wanted to tell you. I am going to say that more than 5 guys are worthy of induction. This is a good group of finalists. So what I'm going to do at the end is I'll tell you who the most deserving 5 are. The limit should be raised, but I have to respect the process. I'll tell you who the deserving Hall of Famers are. Then I'll tell you who would get my vote if I had one. The first guy on the list would definitely get my vote. That's Jared Allen, one of the best sack artists of the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. From 2007 to 2013, he never had less than 11 sacks in a season. He has the 12th most sacks all time, with 136. That puts him ahead of guys like Lawrence Taylor, Ricky Jackson, and Derek Thomas. Those guys are all in the Hall of Fame. Allen was a 5-time Pro Bowler, 4-time first-team All-Pro. He's a Hall of Famer. The next guy up is Willie Anderson. It's very hard to evaluate offensive linemen for the Hall of Fame unless they were insanely dominant. More often than not, they don't get in. And Willie Anderson was a good right tackle. I mean, he had a 4-year stretch from 2003 to 2006 where he was as good as anyone. Made the Pro Bowl every year that stretch. 3-time first-team All-Pro during that stretch. Really good player. Not a Hall of Famer. You've got to have more than a 4-year stretch for me to put you in the Hall of Fame. Willie Anderson was a good player. Very good player, as a matter of fact. Not a Hall of Famer. That brings us now to Rondae Barber. A guy who had a stretch of football in the 2000s that was as good as any defensive player's stretch. I mean, from 2001 to 2008, this guy was one of the best corners in the NFL. He was a 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro, won a Super Bowl in 2002, made the Hall of Fame's All-2000s team. He is a Hall of Famer. I don't think there's any question about that. If you remember watching him play, and I do, he was great when I was first getting into football. You know how dominant Rondae Barber was. He's a Hall of Famer. He just is. Tony Boselli is a sad story. He's been a perennial finalist for a while now. The thing is, though, he got hurt during the 2001 season. and that ended what should have been a Hall of Fame career prematurely. I don't think there's any question about it. If Tony Boselli hadn't gotten hurt, he would be a first ballot Hall of Famer. That's how great he was. Sadly, he did get hurt. And part of being great is staying healthy. He had a 5-year stretch where he was as good as any offensive tackle in the league. From 96 to 2000, he was a 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first team All-Pro, made the Hall of Fame's All-90s team, and rightfully so. But I've got to ding him for the injuries. Again, part of being great is staying healthy. And a 5-year stretch isn't enough to get you into the Hall of Fame. I'm sorry, it's just not. It's a sad story. In an alternate universe, Tony Boselli is in the Hall of Fame. But in this one, he falls short. That brings us to Leroy Butler, a guy who was one of the best safeties of the 1990s. 4-time Pro Bowler, 4-time first team All-Pro, won a Super Bowl with the Packers, made the Hall of Fame's All-90s team. Really good player. Not a Hall of Famer, though. Only 4 Hall of Fame years, 3 of which were consecutive. 93, he was great. 94 and 95, he was solid. Then 96 to 98, he was great. If I'm going to put you in on dominance, which is something that a lot of Pro Football Hall of Famers are in on, I have no problem putting players in on dominance, but it's got to be in a row, and it's got to be a lengthy period of success. Butler doesn't have that. Not a Hall of Famer. That brings us to, by far and away, the most interesting finalist. Devin Hester. There is no question that Devin Hester is one of the greatest return men in NFL history. Constantly led the NFL in those categories. 4-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first team All-Pro. I mean, he was the league's premier return man for a while. Does that get you into the Hall of Fame? That's the question. Does being a great return man get you into the Hall of Fame? I don't think it does. And I'm going to tell you why. You think about the best return men in NFL history. You think of guys like Josh Cribbs, Cordero Patterson, Leon Washington, Brian Mitchell, Allen Rossum, Mel Gray, Eric Metcalf, Desmond Howard, Dave Meggett, Rick Upchurch, etc., etc. None of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. If we're going to put in Hester, and I'm not opposed to it, okay, he is borderline. There is no question about that. I respect the dominant player that Hester was. Believe me, I remember watching him play. We've got to put in a lot of other great special teamers. You know where Devin Hester ranks on the all-time kick and punt return yards leaderboard? 8th. He's behind Mitchell, Rossum, Cribbs, Gray, Glenn Milburn, Dante Hall, and Darren Sproles. In fact, everyone in the top 26 is not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Steve Tasker isn't in the Hall of Fame. Steve Tasker was a great special teamer. He was a perennial finalist for a while. He never got in. Is Matthew Slater getting in? I don't think so. You want to tell me that we need to correct that? That we need to honor the greats of the third phase of the game? Okay. I'm with you there. I have no problem with that. But until something special is done to honor those guys, I can't say that Hester's a Hall of Famer. It's very close. There's no question about it. I understand the argument for putting him in. But given the fact that some of the great return men of all time aren't even going to sniff the Hall of Fame anytime soon, I can't put Hester in the Hall. That brings us to a surefire Hall of Famer, Tory Holt. It has been way too long for Holt. This guy's been a finalist for many years. From 2000 to 2007, this guy was as good as any wide receiver in the NFL. 7-time Pro Bowler. Made a first-team All-Pro team. Is in the Hall of Fame's All-2000s team. Won a Super Bowl with the greatest show on turf. You look at where he is on the career leaderboards. Receiving yards, he's 16th all-time. He's ahead of Hall of Famers like Andre Reed, Steve Largent, and Art Monk. Career receptions, he's 22. Ahead of guys like James Lofton, Michael Irvin, and Charlie Joyner. Tory Holt is a Hall of Famer. There is no question about it. That brings us to another wide receiver who should be in the Hall of Fame. Andre Johnson was a bright spot on some really bad Texans teams. Stuck with them for a long time, which I think means something. This guy was a 7-time Pro Bowler, 2-time first-team All-Pro, 11th most receptions and receiving yards in NFL history. You want to hear something funny? He was the 3rd overall pick in the 2003 NFL Draft. With the 1st overall pick, the Bengals took Carson Palmer. I think it's safe to say that worked out. You know who was taken 2nd overall by the Detroit Lions? I'll give you a hint. It was a wide receiver. Charles Rogers. A guy who only played 15 games in his 3 years in the NFL. Only had 36 catches for 440 yards. Was taken 1 pick in front of someone who I'm saying should be in the Hall of Fame. Gotta love Matt Millen. That brings us now to Sam Mills. Another really sad story. In 2003, long after his playing career was over, he was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. He hung around for almost 2 years, but ultimately died at the age of 45. his number 51 is the only number that's been retired by the Panthers. Not Steve Smith, not Luke Kuechly, not Julius Peppers, not Thomas Davis. None of those guys. Sam Mills. That tells you how important he was to that team. As great a story as Mills is, he's not a Hall of Famer. Very good player, but his Hall of Fame years weren't all in a row. It was 87, 88, then 91 and 92, then 95 and 96. Again, I like your Hall of Fame years to come in a row. I mean, there's no question that Mills has been helped by his untimely death. He gets sympathy votes. He was a very good player, but he's not a Hall of Famer. 5-time Pro Bowler, made a first-team All-Pro in 1996, the second year of the Panthers' existence, but he's not a Hall of Famer. That brings us now to someone who I grew up hating, and you have no idea how much it kills me to say that this guy is a Hall of Famer. Richard Seymour. This guy was one of the best defensive linemen in the NFL in the 2000s. He's on the Hall of Fame's All-2000s team, 7-time Pro Bowler, made 3 straight first-team All-Pros from 2003 to 2005, was there for the first part of the Patriots dynasty. I mean, this guy was great for the Patriots. Took some years off where he was great. Then, in 2010 and 2011, he made 2 Pro Bowls for the Raiders. That's impressive. If I'm looking at it for just in a row, Seymour's 5-year stretch was incredible. And again, think back to the 2000s. Think about the most feared defensive players. You had guys like Brian Urlacher, Ray Lewis, Dwight Freeney, Robert Mathis, but Richard Seymour was right there. Maybe he doesn't have the stats, but if you go back in time and put yourself in that mindset, he's a Hall of Famer. Now here's another guy who I grew up hating. Zach Thomas. Zach Thomas and Jason Taylor. 2 guys who I grew up hating. Then Jason Taylor went to the Jets, and I really liked him. From the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, Zach Thomas was one of the best linebackers in the NFL. He didn't have the sacks that guys like Urlacher and Lewis did. I'm not saying that those guys were great sack artists. They weren't, but Thomas was not a great pass rusher, but my God, was he an excellent tackler. My God, was he dominant. You never wanted to run the ball in his direction. You did everything in your power to get your ball carrier as far away from Zach Thomas as humanly possible. From 1998 to 2006, this guy made the Pro Bowl every year with the exception of 2004. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro, made the Hall of Fame's All-2000s team. It kills me to say it, but he's a Hall of Famer. Now, it'll kill Giants fans to say that this guy's a Hall of Famer, but he is, be fair, Demarcus Ware. Forget dominance for a minute. I've been saying that enough. Demarcus Ware has the 9th most sacks in NFL history with 138.5. Do I need to say any more than that? From 2006 to 2015, he made the Pro Bowl every year, with the exception of 2013. 4-time first-team All-Pro. Won a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning and the Broncos. Made the Hall of Fame's All-2000s team. He's a surefire Hall of Famer. You don't even need to think about it. Here's another guy who you don't need to think about. Reggie Wayne. Let me give you an interesting fact about Reggie Wayne. He was actually picked with a New York Giants pick. What happened was the Giants moved up 8 spots with the Colts to take Will Allen, who really wasn't that great. In exchange, the Giants gave up the pick that eventually became Reggie Wayne. I mean, there were some years where Wayne and Marvin Harrison played together. In fact, they played together for most of Wayne's career. But after Harrison retired, Wayne really stepped up as the true go-to guy for Peyton Manning. I mean, not for nothing, but if Pierre Garçon is your second best wide receiver, you need your best wide receiver to be great. And Reggie Wayne was great. 6-time Pro Bowler, made a first-team All-Pro, won a Super Bowl with Manning with the Colts, has the 10th most receiving yards and receptions in NFL history. This guy's a Hall of Famer. You don't need to think too hard about it. And the same thing goes to this guy. I don't know how it's taken so long to put Patrick Willis into the Hall of Fame. I mean, I understand that he doesn't have the longevity that you'd like. Alright, it's the same issue that a guy like Tony Baselli has. The thing is, though, Willis was better. Willis lasted longer. Patrick Willis played 8 seasons in the NFL. In 2014, he only played in 6 games. Alright, he had a left big toe injury that ultimately resulted in him retiring from the NFL. So you take the 14 season out of the equation, where he was a shell of his former self, and again, only played in 6 games. This guy made the Pro Bowl every year, was a 5-time first-team All-Pro, was easily the best linebacker of that era. I don't think it's close. Patrick Willis is a Hall of Famer. Period. Case closed. His peak is infinitely better than Baselli's. That brings us to another former Niners defensive player, Bryant Young. Bryant Young was a really good player. 4-time Pro Bowler. Won a Super Bowl with Steve Young. Made the Hall of Fame's All-90s team. Won Comeback Player of the Year. Had a really good career, but not a Hall of Famer. His Hall of Fame years really aren't in a row, except for 01 and 02. 2000 isn't a Hall of Fame year. I'm sorry, it's just not. He's low on the sacks leaderboard. Very good player, certainly a member of the Hall of Very Good, not a Hall of Famer. So if you've been keeping score, I said that 9 of these guys should be in the Hall of Fame. I can only vote for 5, technically. When I'm looking at the 9 guys who I said should be in, I feel like I've got to take out Seymour and Willis. The thing with Seymour is, as great as he was, and man alive was he great, he's very low on the all-time leaderboards. He's 147th on the sacks leaderboard. Doesn't have bold type. Was incredibly dominant. Okay, great player. But if I'm looking for a reason to take someone off the ballot, that's as good as any. And Patrick Willis, as great as he was, the fact that he retired at such a young age, I mean, I've got to ding him for that. I've got to be a little fair. If I'm saying that Tony Baselli's not a Hall of Famer because he got hurt, I can't put Patrick Willis in when there were other deserving candidates because he got hurt, even though Willis had a better peak. And he is a Hall of Famer, like he should be in the Hall of Fame. But I can't put him on this ballot. I'm sorry, it's just tough. Like, I'm looking for reasons to exclude people. Maybe they're not great reasons, but they make sense in my head. Like, if you want to slam your fist on the table and say that Seymour and Willis are surefire Hall of Famers, it's not even a contest, fine. Fair. I'm not going to argue with you. In that same vein, I'll take Rondae Barber out. I understand that it's hard for incredibly dominant corners to be on the leaderboard. Like, if you're a great corner, you're not going to get a lot of interceptions because no one's throwing the ball to you. But again, if I'm looking for a reason to exclude someone, that's as good a reason as any to get rid of Rondae Barber. I'm sorry. And you know what? I don't want to have 3 wide receivers on my ballot. I'll put in 2, but not 3. I don't want over half my ballot to consist of the same position. Again, you may think that these are terrible reasons, and I totally get it, but they make sense in my head. Like, if you have an issue, take it up with the Hall of Fame. I'd love to put all these guys in, but I can't. With that being said, of the group of Holt, Johnson, and Wayne, from most dominant to least dominant, the correct order is Wayne, Johnson, Holt. Because of that, I've got to take Holt off my ballot. So my final ballot, again, if I had one, would consist of Jared Allen, Andre Johnson, Zach Thomas, Demarcus Ware, and Reggie Wayne. Alright, now I'll give you some college football Valk talk. There is a bowl game that's going to happen tonight. It's the Texas Bowl. LSU versus KSU. Because nothing says Texas like Louisiana State University going up against Kansas State University. LSU is at a huge disadvantage in this game. Tyrion Davis-Price has declared for the NFL draft. He's going to sit out this bowl game. He was the Tigers' best player this year. Ran for over 1,000 yards, had 6 touchdowns. So it's really going to be up to Max Johnson to win this game by himself. I mean, Johnson's a solid quarterback. Completed over 60% of his passes for over 2,800 yards, 27 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. But I'd be a lot more confident in the Tigers if they had Davis Price. I'd also be a lot more confident in them if Ed Orgeron was coaching this game, but he's not. Instead, Brad Davis will be the interim head coach. Next year, obviously, starts the Brian Kelly era in Baton Rouge. And again, I think he's going to do a great job. I really, really do. Defensively, you've got to pay attention to guys like Cordell Flott, Jaquelin Roy, B.J. Ojolari, Micah Baskerville, Dwight McLaughlin, and Damone Clark. No Neil Farrell Jr., he's going into the draft also. That's really going to hurt LSU. I mean, the fact that they're so short-handed is really, really going to hurt them in this game. There's no question about that. When you look at the Wildcats, they're a ground and pound team. Their offense solely revolves around Deuce Vaughn. They're going to run the ball down your throat with Vaughn, a guy who had over 1,200 rushing yards this year and 15 touchdowns, and just so happened to also be the Wildcats' leading receiver this year. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention KSU's offensive line. Cooper Beebe, Josh Rivas, Hayden Gillum, Ben Adler, and Christian Duffy comprised a really strong unit. And defensively, the Wildcats are very talented. You take a look at guys like Felix Anadike-Uzomah, Russ Yeast, Eli Huggins, Ross Elder, Julius Brents, T. Denson, Reggie Stubblefield, Jalen Pickle, Nate Matlack. The list goes on and on. KSU this year allowed the 23rd fewest points per game in the nation. Their mark was 21.1. Chris Kleiman is doing a good job with that program. Certainly a tough ask to take over for a legend like Bill Snyder, but Kleiman's doing a solid job. I think the Wildcats are by far and away the better team. They're a lot less short-handed. Gimme KSU. There were some deaths that happened in the sports world that I didn't get the chance to talk about previously. I'll do it now. The Pro Football Hall of Fame came earlier. I didn't have a problem doing it today. So I'll eulogize the people who need to be eulogized right now. The first one is Sam Jones, who died on the 30th at the age of 88. Sam Jones was an integral part of Russell's Celtics. You think of Russell's supporting cast. You think of guys like John Havlicek, Bob Cousy, Tom Heinsohn, Satch Sanders, Don Nelson, Frank Ramsey, etc., etc. The Joneses were right there, Casey and Sam. Two guys who would be joined at the hip for time immemorial. They weren't brothers. That's a common misconception. And it's kind of sad. Casey Jones died on Christmas Eve 2020. Sam Jones died on New Year's Eve 2021. Very close to each other. Very creepy that two guys linked to each other as closely as Casey and Sam are died so close to each other. I mean, you don't need me to tell you how great Russell's Celtics were. 11 titles in 13 years. What I will say is, Jones was around for 10 of those titles. Jones has the second most titles in NBA history behind only Russell. And he was an integral part of those teams. He was not a hanger-on. This guy may have been the best shooter on those teams. His jump shot was lethal. He could bank it in with regularity. And he was incredibly clutch. Jones made 5 All-Star teams, made 3 All-NBA second teams, and led the Celtics in scoring 5 times. As great as Russell was, at the end of the day, you still need scoring to win. You know that Russell was a great rebounder. You know that he was a great defensive player. You know that he was a great shot blocker. That's all well and good. You still need to score if you're going to win. And with a guy like Sam Jones leading the way, you were in pretty good shape. Sam Jones is, without question, one of the greatest NBA players ever. It's not even up for debate. It's okay if you don't want to put him in the top 20. I get that. I'm not arguing that. But top 50? He's there. He was that great. The second and last guy who I want to talk about is Dan Reeves, who died on New Year's Day at the age of 77 from dementia. Dan Reeves is one of the best coaches in NFL history. I don't think there's a question about that. I understand that he never won a Super Bowl, but he made it 4 times, finished with 190 wins. That puts him 10th all time. There's no question about it. He is one of the best coaches ever. He had an interesting start to his coaching journey. He was a running back for the Cowboys in the mid to late 60s. And was a solid running back. Not great, not terrible. What happened was, in 1968, he got hurt. He only played in 4 games. Reeves had gotten leapfrogged on the depth chart by guys like Calvin Hill and Walt Garrison. So Tom Landry said to Reeves, become a player coach. And that's how Reeves got his start. He was a player coach. Then he became a full-time assistant coach. He paid his dues for a while. It wasn't until 1981 that the Broncos came calling. At the time, Reeves was the youngest head coach in NFL history. And he got off to a good enough start. The Broncos went 10-6 his first year. Then in 82, everything came crashing down. Craig Morton's age finally caught up to him. Steve DeBerg was inept. Mark Herman was inept. The Broncos needed a quarterback if they were gonna avoid finishing with 2 wins again. The Broncos finished 2-7 in 82. Fortunately for Reeves, a young up-and-coming quarterback was upset with his team. That man's name was John Elway. Of course, you know the story. Elway didn't want to play for the Colts. He was concerned about their future. His father, Jack, didn't want him to play for Frank Kush. I mean, John Elway nearly ended up with the Yankees. Reeves saw the greatness in Elway. So he pushed for an Elway trade. Obviously, Elway ended up going to the Broncos for Chris Hinton, Herman, and a first-round pick in the 84 draft, who would later turn into Ron Solt. And as you know, those Elway teams were incredible. Now, it's kind of interesting. Just like John Madden was involved in iconic moments, Reeves was also involved in iconic moments. In 86, the Broncos and Browns met in the AFC title game. The score was 20-13 Browns with 5.5 minutes left in the game. The Broncos had the ball at their own 2-yard line. Elway led the Broncos on the drive. That's all it's known as, the drive. The epic 98-yard drive that sent the Browns to Super Bowl 21. Unfortunately for Reeves and Elway, Phil Simms had the second greatest quarterback performance in Super Bowl history, and the Giants won 39-20. The year after that, it was a rematch between the Broncos and Browns in the AFC title game. This time, the Browns had gone on a nice little drive. It was 38-31 Broncos late in the game. 2nd and 5 at the Broncos' 8-yard line. The Browns are in good position to tie this game up. Bernie Kosar hands the ball off to Ernest Biner. Biner ends up fumbling the ball. It was recovered by Jeremiah Castile, who also caused the fumble. The Broncos ended up winning 38-33. What happened was, on the ensuing drive, Reeves told his punter, Mike Horan, to take an intentional safety rather than risk a punt return touchdown. In all fairness to Biner, though, Castile never should have been in that position. Marty Schottenheimer said for a while that it was Webster Slaughter's job to block Castile. Instead, Slaughter just watched the play unfold, so Castile was able to jar the ball loose. But regardless, the Broncos made it to Super Bowl 22, where they got creamed by the Redskins 42-10. The Broncos would make it back to the Super Bowl 2 years later, but they got absolutely crushed by the Niners 55-10. After that, things went south between Elway and Reeves. Reeves felt that Mike Shanahan, the offensive coordinator, was causing a rift between him and Elway. I mean, it was a toxic situation. Shanahan was fired after the 91 season, even though the Broncos went 12-4 and made it to the AFC title game. But the Broncos had a really bad year in 92. They went 8-8. Reeves was fired after the season. He was replaced by Wade Phillips. Phillips did not have a great 2 years in Denver. So he ended up being replaced in 1995 by Mike Shanahan. Serendipity at its finest. Reeves had a couple good years after leaving the Broncos. He coached the Giants and the Falcons afterwards. It's kind of funny. Reeves started out great, but then he just slowly faded away. Like Reeves' first year at the Giants. They went 11-5. Their defense was incredible. It was the best in the league. But in the divisional round, they gave up 44 points to the Niners. Then after that, Reeves went 9-7, then 5-11, then 6-10. Granted, part of that was due to George Young's decline. Towards the end of his time with the Giants, he was not a good drafter. He did not do well in free agency. That didn't help Reeves, but still, you gotta do better than a career 31-33 record. You never want to be under 500. Reeves landed with the Falcons in 97. In 98, the Falcons went on an improbable run to the Super Bowl. No one thought they'd be as good as they were that year. After going 7-9 in Reeves' first year, the Falcons went 14-2. They beat the Niners in the divisional round 20-18. They orchestrated a great comeback against the Vikings in the NFC title game, tying the game up with less than a minute left in the fourth quarter. Then Morton Anderson won it in overtime. So that set up Super Bowl 33 between Dan Reeves' Falcons and Mike Shanahan's and John Elway's Broncos. You think that meant something extra to him? Unfortunately for Reeves, the Broncos really destroyed the Falcons in that game. They were up 31-6 in the fourth quarter. They ended up winning 34-19. The Falcons really struggled after that. They had an old Chris Chandler who really wasn't getting the job done anymore. They needed an infusion of talent at the quarterback position. Much like what happened in 1983, Reeves was able to pounce on a quarterback who couldn't make it work with the team that was slated to pick him. The consensus first overall pick in the 2001 draft was Michael Vick. The Chargers were trying to work out a contract with Vick before the draft, as was done at the time. This was before the rookie wage scale. The two sides couldn't come to an agreement. So on the day before the draft, the Chargers traded the first overall pick to the Falcons for the 5th overall pick, which the Chargers would use on LaDainian Tomlinson. So it worked out for both teams. The 67th overall pick, which the Chargers used on Tay Cody. That didn't work, but again, LT. The Falcons' second rounder in 2002, which the Chargers used on Rashae Caldwell, didn't really work out, but again, LT. And Tim Dwight, who didn't have a great run with the Chargers, but again, LT. It worked out for both teams. Unfortunately for Reeves, he wasn't around to experience Vick's dominance. Vick got hurt before the 2003 season was set to get underway. It was a fractured right fibula that he suffered in a preseason game against the Ravens. And the Falcons were bad that year. They started out 3-10. Reeves was fired. He was replaced by, guess who? Wade Phillips. Again, you gotta love serendipity. Meanwhile, the year after that, Jim Mora comes in. Vick stays healthy, becomes one of the greatest dual-threat quarterbacks in NFL history. Looks like he's going to lead the Falcons to the promised land. Then the dogfighting incident happened. The Atlanta Falcons, one of the most snake-bit franchises in the NFL. But there's no question about it, Reeves' time in Atlanta was a success. He did help get them Michael Vick, who would have done absolutely spectacular things with the Falcons if the dogfighting incident had never happened. Don't let the record fool you. It's hurt by the 3-10 season, which wasn't his fault. Vick got hurt. Of course the Falcons were going to struggle. Dan Reeves helped two teams land franchise quarterbacks. Very few people can say that. May Sam Jones and Dan Reeves both rest in peace. Until tomorrow, I'm Jacob Valk. And always remember, if you disagree with me, you're wrong.